So hello, today I'm at Ingatestone Hall in Ingatestone in Essex. I'd like to talk to you about the history of the hall and the people associated with it. So this beautiful old hall and rolling Essex countryside is set just over a mile from Ingatestone village. In fact, it's only a 12-minute walk in a straight line from the hall to Ingatestone church. To understand the area's history, we will go back into the prehistory period of 450,000 years ago. For a cataclysmic event occurred, causing the Ice Age of Anglia. An absolute colossal wall of ice ran across these lands which we're looking at today, 3,000 feet thick or 1,000 metres in new money. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
It's simply hard to imagine, and as I walked through here recently, I gauged the height to be higher than a small aircraft which fly over here. So we're talking somewhere up there. At around 11,700 years ago, the ice retreated, dropping huge sarsen stones. Ingatestone village today still has 3 of these sarsen stones from the past. The rolling land here is dominated by the River Wid. It simply cuts through like a giant serpent of old. Now, once a watermill and bridge dominated the landscape here, exactly where I stand now. It was actually recorded as such in 1351. The land here was carved by the meltwaters of ice, leaving what we see today. The Saxons described a meadow being here. In Saxon it was Ing, and later described as Ingatestone, meadow by the stone. Barking Abbey today, part of London, but once part of Essex, would own the land here. Barking Abbey goes back to the time of St Ekenwald of 666 AD, and he would in fact be the first Bishop of London, and is still the patron saint of London itself. It would be his sister who would become the Abbess of Barking's Abbey. The Abbess was in charge of the Augustinian nuns at the time. Now, local legend says that St Ced of 654 AD first established Christianity to Essex. He preached under a pear tree where Butsbury's church stands today, which is straight in front of us. Now, at the moment we're in a heat wave, and if you look at the ground, we have the leaves that have fallen from the trees. It's almost like autumn. Not seen this before. Today's weather is a glorious 30 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. But 284 years would pass. In 950 AD, in the reign of King Edgar the Peaceful, Barking Abbey took over all the lands around Ingatestone and the old Saxon manor here. Now, each abbess would collect revenues from her lands. She would ride out with the sergeantry escort. The manor here was known as Jingi Abbatassy, and it had a farm and land attached, just as it is today. This was in fact the capital manor of Essex to Barking Abbey, and Barking Abbey was one of the most important abbeys of that time. This would in fact attract some very high profile women of that time. Now each abbess would spend 2 weeks of each summer right here, and I shall read you out this incredible list. Queen Matilda of Scotland, wife of King Henry I, 1104. Queen Matilda, wife of King Stephen, 1136. Duchess Matilda, daughter of King Henry II, 1175. Mary, sister of St Thomas Becket, 1173. Maud, illegitimate daughter of King John, 1247. And Katherine Sutton, 1358, who was England's first female playwright. Then everything would change in 1535. King Henry VIII ordered his chief secretary, Thomas Cromwell, to shut down the monasteries, the moneys and lands becoming crown property. Cromwell gave the task to Sir William Petre to close Barkin's Abbey, and we've got a picture of Sir William here. Now, Sir William was introduced to Henry VIII through the Boleyn family and was appointed clerk in Chancery. He had studied law at Oxford and would work on the case of Katherine of Aragon in 1529. Sir William was promoted to Deputy of Cornwall himself, or Cromwell himself. He would visit all the monasteries in southern England. Can you imagine that? And 90% would be closed down, and they would actually release £1 million to the crown. Now in 1538 the Abbess of Barking was 49-year-old Dorothy Barley, who was responsible for 30 nuns. Sir William and the Petre family were friends with the Abbess, and it must have been an awkward situation for him, but he had a job to do and he was rewarded well. Now by December 1539, Sir William had paid the full market price of £849 for Ingatestone Manor, which we can see directly in front of us. Interestingly, he was also married to Gertrude Tyrrell, whose sister, Mary Tyrrell, was one of the last nuns of Barking Abbey. Sir William would give generously to the now unemployed nuns. There would be 30 in total. A pension each, which went on into the reign of Queen Mary. Now King Henry himself simply wrote, "Surrender by Dorothy Barley, Abbess and the convent of the monastery, and all its possessions in Essex, 14th of November 1539. Dorothy herself would be the last abbess, and with her went 800 years of history. She retired in nearby Weald village. Now Sir William was a devout Catholic and was absolved of any involvement in the monastery breakups by Pope Paul IV, as long as he built almshouses in Ingatestone for the poor, and which he did. Now Sir William would go on to build the hall we see today between 1540 and 1550, described as very fair, large and stately, made of brick and embattled. Now again Sir William was promoted, this time to the King's Secretary. And we have another picture of Sir William here. Now he was knighted in 1543 and he was made a Privy Councillor and he'd be investigating heresy. He would judge the trials of Bishop Bonar. And Bishop Bonar was actually the Bishop of London. Now the bishop, he dealt with the ecclesiastical, excuse my pronunciation, the tribunals, and up to 300 people being executed for their religious beliefs in the time of Queen Mary. Now Queen Mary herself would visit Ingatestone Hall and swear in Sir William for his loyalty, making him her Secretary of State. It's incredible to think that so many queens of England have stayed here. And we have a picture of Queen Mary. Now in 1557 Petre resigned from his post due to ill health. When Elizabeth I came to the throne, the Catholic persecutions were renewed once more. Now remarkably, the Catholic presence carried on here regardless at Ingatestone Hall. Sir William himself served the new Queen, and this time taking custody of Lady Jane Grey, the younger sister of Lady Jane Grey. And for the next 2 years, young Katherine was confined to the garden chamber of the hall, right here. Now I'm not exactly sure where the garden chamber is, but I've got a feeling it's where we're standing now, because originally there would be a west wing which would make a central courtyard, or what they call the inner courtyard, and we'll now be standing in the outer courtyard. And I've actually got a picture of Lady Katherine Grey. Now we actually have a picture of Katherine Grey, and she was basically kept in the Tower of London, and she bore 2 children while she was in prison there. And we've actually got a picture of that as well. It's quite incredible. She's very young, she was 28 I believe when she passed away. I'm not sure if this is her first son, who was Edward, or Thomas, but the first son was sent back to the father and she came to live here with the second son, who was called Thomas. Now in 1571, after many years of service to so many monarchs, Sir William was appointed the first Chancellor of the Order of the Garter, and a year later he'd pass away. He's actually buried in Ingatestone's parish church, and I recommend a visit. The life-size effigy of Sir William and his second wife Anne sits on a tabletop tomb. Set on the floor next to his tomb, a memorial slab to his first wife, who is Gertrude Tyrrell. As I understand it, he wished to be buried with both his wives, but he obviously loved them both very much. Now in the time of Elizabeth I, John Payne, the Catholic priest, would live at the old hall here, and it was strictly forbidden to have such association at this time. I've got a picture of John Payne. Now John Payne lived here and disguised himself as Lady Petre's steward, and he would be holding mass in a small room somewhere in the hall. And during the winter of 1576, Payne was informed upon and he was arrested. He was imprisoned and then released 1 month later. And so he returned to France. But within a year he was back at Ingatestone's Hall. And whilst here he met George Eliot, who was in fact the priest hunter, having caught 30 priests by 1581. And once more Payne would be arrested. A more trumped up charge of treason to murder Queen Elizabeth I was set and to set his fate. He was sent off to London's Tower of London without a trial. Now Payne was tortured twice on the rack and sent to Chelmsford for execution. Now he was actually admired by many, and on the day the crowd pulled on his feet from the gallows, preventing the hangman from carrying out the disembowelment process while he was still alive. Now inside the hall you can still see 2 priests' hiding places that Payne and others most likely used when a search occurred here. So now we're at the entrance of Ingatestone's Hall, and we'll have more of a look of the actual building itself. So we start with the entrance itself. You can see an iron gate. Now passing through these iron gates, originally a pressure plate would release a series of springs and plates, and the gates would open for motor vehicles. But impatient drivers in the past were caught out and the gate actually snapped on the vehicles. And if you look, well, it's actually hard to see, but this gate, for example, has got a large kink in it. Now, just to give you an idea, the road that comes out of here, this goes to Ingatestone, it's a short drive, and the road that goes down here will go to Mount Nessing and Billericay, and then you've got the car parks in here. Now, as we move forward, we have the Gatehouse. It's the most attractive building. I guess these are a more recent addition to control access to and from the hall itself. I don't know when they were built. Now as we walk down, we've got a very attractive avenue, I guess, of lime trees, I'm presuming. Now as we walk past the entrance, we've got, on the left hand side, we've got some 19th century farm buildings, but what we have in front of us is a very old building indeed. It's actually called a Tive Barn. Now farmers as tenants were required to give, for example, 1/10 of their crop to Barking Abbey, and the share would be counted and stored right here in these buildings. The Tive Barns themselves were common across Northern Europe in the Middle Ages, and this is perhaps the oldest building here. So what we have in front of us is called the Clock Tower. It's actually my favourite part of Ingatestone's Hall. It's Tudor or earlier in date. It's most likely the original gatehouse to control access to the estate. Through here passed Queen Mary and Elizabeth and all the lords and barons throughout the centuries. If we pan around, there's the original, well, there's the most modern access gate. So I'll just put it on wide angle so we can get a better idea of the scale of it. You can see some of the additional buildings. And they almost wrap themselves around you, these buildings. So if you look up above, we've got the motto Sans Dieu rien in French. Again, excuse my French, meaning nothing without God. And the Petre family crest also, which I'll show you, are 2 lines back to back. Now the name Petre derives from the saints and disciples of the Christian church. and in Greek Petros meaning the rock. The name became popular in Europe following the Crusades. It's first recorded of being a Petre in 1195, where we have Ralph Petre in the reign of Richard the Lionheart. And if we look forward, we can see the view of the hall as you approach under the arch. And there we have a closer view of the motto. And if you look at the actual clock, it's actually 18th century, it's only one-handed, and this was very popular from its time. So again, we should take a closer look at the two-headed or the back-to-back lines from the motto. And one of the features I find interesting, if you look above to the left of the lines, is a cutout here. So originally this would have been some other, and again in the corner there, another feature of the original building. I believe this arch section has been added in another century more recent. Also, if we look at the chimneys, we can see that there's some support rods to stop them blowing. Another fine view now that we're going under the clock tower and the arch. We're going to enter the outer courtyard. And the buildings that are actually in the outer courtyard were basically the powerhouse of the whole estate. And we'll have a look at them. So some of these buildings were the brewery, the slaughterhouse, the buttery, the cheese chamber, the laundry rooms, the candle room, and so many more. And it made Ingatestone Hall completely self-sufficient. So this would be indeed the outer courtyard. Now, as if by magic, I've got a picture here which shows how the outer courtyard and inner courtyard would have looked. Now we're still standing in the outer courtyard. I just wanted to show you this yew hedge. Now at one stage there was a long building that dominated this area where the hedge is today. So you can imagine that this courtyard is completely enclosed. Now we stand still in the outer courtyard. This is the mulberry trees which were planted in 1923. Now the mulberry fruit was very popular with the Tudors. You could make pies, tarts, eat them as they are, or even ferment them into mead or wine. Now King James I was a big patron of the mulberry. He created the mulberry garden at St James's Palace. Now King James would establish 10,000 trees across London, many still there today, and it's likely that Barking Abbey grew mulberries, as they've been discovered in other ruins of abbeys. Now originally these were from ancient Persia. So I just wanted to show you what a mulberry actually looks like. Before they're ripe, they're kind of like a reddish pinkish colour. And then when they're ripe, these particular ones are extremely big. So now we're looking at the inner courtyard, or part of the building itself. Now we approach the main house with its inner courtyard. So what you see today from the time of Sir William, notice the crow-stepped gable up here. You can see the Tudor brick, and you've got the medieval style turret in the distance there. Now This would have required permission from the king or queen at the time to build this. So when Sir William died, his widow Anne Brown continued to reside here, and then their son, who was John Petre the First Lord, and he would carry on. We've got a picture of John. Now he would in fact become the High Sheriff of Essex in 1575. The High Sheriff would represent the monarch in her absence. The sheriffs were responsible for law and order. Now the ancient roll, when I looked it up, dates back to Edward I of 939 AD, so just before Barking Abbey came to these lands here. Lord John would also become Deputy Lieutenant and the Knight of the Shire. He would take command of 600 of the Essex militia, set up at the time of the Spanish Armada. In his spare time, John would play many instruments in the corridors and rooms of this old building, such as the lute and the violins. And he was also friend and patron to the famous composer William Byrd, who played actually here. I think he came from Staunton Massey, from memory. Now Lord John would go on to purchase Faundon Hall, and so the Petre family for the next 300 years would live there. Now Ingatestone Hall would become more or less a holiday retreat, or for married heirs' quarters as such. Now we're actually looking where the hall would have been, which would have been roughly here. Now once the west wing stood right here, and it would have spanned right away across here, so there would have been a main entrance here. Now the main hall, the buttery and the beer cellar were all demolished around 1800, and this was done by the 9th Lord Petre, Robert. Now Robert also demolished Faundon Hall and had it rebuilt, and Robert would also receive King George III at his new home. He would also become the Grand Master of the Freemasons in England in 1776. Also I found out he was responsible for the creation of the Chelmer and Blackwater canals, which still are there today. Now above the hall, which is more or less thin air now, stood the great chamber and dining room, and now only fresh air and gravel. It's incredible to think what could have been happening there. Now we're looking at the old pear tree, and it looks a lot older than it is. It's planted in 1974. Now the original tree, and you can see from the retaining hooks, was planted after the hall was demolished around 1800. Now if we look, we can see the hooks. You can almost follow where the old branches would have gone. So now we're right in the centre of the inner courtyard. You can see the stairwell there with the embattlement on the top. So I'm guessing where we're standing now would have been the hall, and this would have been the access to the original hall, possibly the buttery. Not sure. Now we're to the rear of the property, and I'd like to show you the building or the structure in the centre there, which I believe used to extend to the It's an incredibly hot day today. It's 30 degrees. And you can see some people taking shade, much needed shade under that lovely old tree. So now we're at the stew pond, and it's said to be as old as the house itself. It was built to supply fish for the table, basically. It's got a fresh spring somewhere in the pond, so this would give it the ultimate in clean water for the fish. It's most likely that the abbesses from the old days would have drank the spring water from here, perhaps even St. Ced himself did. Again, we will never know, but it's most idyllic. And if you look closely, you can see dragonflies. And we have what looks like an incredibly old willow tree. You look at the trunk. Now, something I did notice as I walked across this, I guess it could be a little brook under there, these railway sleepers. So Ingatestone, the land, the original railway ran through here, I believe in the 1840s, perhaps 50s, I'm not sure. So it actually went across the lands here. The station itself is built, well, requested to be built in the same style as this house from the Tudor period. And if you come in here, you've got this lovely avenue of trees. So if you do visit the hall, it's well worth taking a good walk around the grounds where you're allowed to go. So now we're at the furthest end of the stew pond. You can see just how big it really is. So if you look down there, you can see where the stew pond is in relation to the house. And now I'm going to take you down there. Now, when Ingatestone Hall was built, it was very advanced for its time. With contracts of the monastery architects, the building had installed the earliest water-fed toilets in England. Each bedroom had a little room within, it's described. And where do you think it all went? It went straight into the stew pond. So this would be the original system for recycling. So if we look straight ahead, I found another mulberry tree, which this one looks a bit older than the others. What I did notice was it's got a lot of fruit, so I'd like to show you that. So as you can see, it's absolutely heaving with fruit. It's really, really sticky underfoot as well. And they're quite big. So now we're actually on the lime walk itself, originally called the Long Walkie, and again it's as old as the house. Now in 1733 a visitor, a relative actually, Bishop Benjamin Petre, was walking right here where we stand, and he was set upon by some robbers. Now his dog saved him that day, and it's said that the faithful dog's ghost still patrols this very avenue. Inside's a painting of his dog. Now what we see before us is actually, I would say, probably in the top 4 of the oldest yew trees in Essex. You can just make it out through the dappled light. This is a common yew, and it's likely to be over 500 years old and up to 1,000. So now we're back in the courtyard, and I'd like to show you a mounting block. It was used to mount and dismount your horse. Now, these stone blocks were very popular during the 18th and 19th centuries. They were actually nicknamed a josser's block. A josser was a nickname for a priest. Now I've only come across 2 other mounting blocks, both outside churches. One is at Bradwell-on-Sea and the other is at Pagglesham, so consider this very rare. Now what makes this one incredibly unusual is that I believe the 11th Lord Petre, he acquired Napoleon Bonaparte's horse, Marengo, so it's most likely he would have used this block. So today's Ingatestone. So today John is the 18th Baron Petre of Ingatestone's Hall, and he lives nearby. He was also once the Lord Lieutenant of Essex, meaning that he represented Her Majesty the Queen, just as his ancestor Sir William Petre did. Now resident here is his son, the Honourable Dominic Petre, and he manages the day-to-day affairs of the Hall. Well, a turn of events in 1876 meant that the Petre family would move back here, for Thorndon Hall was badly damaged by fire. Now if we move forward to World War II, the hall was used by Wanstead School for Girls, and in the 1950s the north wing was used by the Essex County Council as its record office, and it would stay this way until the 1970s. So in 1989 Lord Petre decided to open the house to the public during the summer months, which we're in now. I would say it's a very interesting house to visit, and you can take a guided tour or go as independent, but please check the details. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I would say it's a very easy way to spend an afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.